I'm very happy that I see that people found where they can do the takeout coffee at the. That's it. Next time we'll just have it here. Yeah, okay, I don't want to waste any time because we are on the schedule. I just want to introduce Dr. Geoff Bil, the University of Delaware, whom I know for a flexible amount of time, but not long. Author of Indexing Indigenous Plants, People and Empire, and a new project coming out called Fields of Empire, Ethnoscience and the Making of the American Century. Take it away. Yeah, thank you. In a while. Don't get, going, but, let me just take that, too soon. So, thank you for being here. I assume, yeah, like a few more stragglers have come in. I'm gonna start my talk here with an object, or an image of an object, and I'm gonna draw some inspiration here from the open event at the Maritime Museum, and also from Meenakshi's request that she's here, that we have a few more natural history specimens. Here you go. Here is a sample specimen for you. Yeah, done. Okay. So this is a very expensive from the New York Botanical Garden, and it helps to illustrate some things that I want to discuss today with respect to what we mean as historians of science when we talk about translation. So we all remember probably Jim in his plenary talk yesterday suggested that translation might be a helpful method for helping us understand how knowledge circulates across geographical and cultural distances. And there's been a lot of work in and around the scene over the last 20 years, and I'm inclined to agree with that area of emphasis. But this begs the question: how does translation work, and what, or perhaps even who, is being translated? And I'm quite invested in this question. So my talk today is based on a chapter I'm writing for a book that I'm co-editing with Tamara Hawkins and Catherine Gutierrez, entitled Plants in Translation, Global Diasporas and Local Entanglements, with Pepper, should know at some point. And one thing this book strives to do is to examine a variety of approaches to understanding what translation is and how historians of science and folks in adjacent fields might be able to use it. So as we're all aware, this line of questioning has some pretty deep roots in our field. I think that Jim referenced it in his talk 20 years ago. And of course, it goes all the way back, at the very least, to Latour and his attempts to understand how scientific networks function, and how allies, materials, data are ruled by scientific actors. We all remember Harry Collins's essay on the scallops. Sometimes they do the enrolling. Well, more recently, scholars of translation, especially interested in querying the boundary between linguistic and cultural translations as we customarily understand them, and other kinds of changes. So in his book, Majors in Translation, Alan Buell opens by situating translation etymologically as one of many terms that developed to refer to different kinds of boundary crossing. Right? Quote, referring to change through movement or movement through change, such as transfer, transit, transport, transmit, transplant, or transcend. To translate means etymologically to carry across, and it originally meant to bear, convey, or remove from one person, place, or condition to another. It could refer to the material conveyance, transport, or transportation of persons or things, as in the translation of the bones of a saint from one place to another, or of a tree from one place to another. I'm partial to the trees. So it's in the spirit of this more fluid and analytically capacious understanding of translation, the awareness is Boris Booty puts it, translation is always more than translation itself, but I propose that there are several kinds of translations or transformations happening simultaneously with a herbarium specimen like this. My cutoff, my hand cut off the top.
You can,
Okay.
let me fix that.
Okay.
Oh, you can also, you are,
Oh, there.
you're on it.
Okay. Thank you. So in these translations or transformations, depending on the vocabulary we want to use, are happening at different scales. So that's exactly the scale of what Elise Burton was talking about yesterday with respect to scales of collaboration. So first, we have a translation between languages and knowledges, between the Latin name Ethnoscientific longipes and the vernacular name Andor Simalu. Andor Simalu is actually from the Toba Batak language, so it uses the phonetic Dutch spelling here. Andor is in fact a term for a parasitic plant, and in Batak language, as it happens, this plant is a climbing plant, right? So it's parasitic in that sense. Malu, on the other hand, most likely references an area just to the west of Lake Toba in northern Sumatra. So the history of the use of this name in Asahan, where Andor Simalu was collected, may also tell a story. Right? It may also be a recollection of its use in Western Highlands, where the Batak migration to the lowlands originated historically. Second, this image also tells a story about translation or transformation of a living plant into a herbarium specimen. Right? Probably something lots of us are familiar with. To some extent, we're talking about the process of collecting it, drying it, certainly in the early 20th century, poisoning it to make sure that insects and so on didn't eat it, and then afterwards mounting it very carefully on the herbarium sheet. Thirdly, we also have the names of the distributor of the plant right here, Hartley Harris Bartlett, who was someone at the University of Michigan. That's something we'll be talking about a little bit more shortly. Then we also have the name of the collector, a man named Rama Sibuya. I'm going to be talking about him as well. But what I hope to show today is that the roles that they played, Rama and Bartlett respectively, in translating Batak botanical and environmental knowledge, also transformed them in the process. And finally, before up there, this translating endeavor that Rama and Bartlett were engaged in was also being undertaken with specific territorial objectives in mind, right? As we'll see. Right, so a lot of things are in movement and flux simultaneously in these kinds of translating endeavors. Now, the story I want to tell begins in 1918 in lowland northeastern Sumatra, in a place called Sumatra, which is where Ramat and Bartlett first met. Now, this was a predominantly Toba Batak village, roughly 8 miles west of the city of Kisara. Kisara being the nearest urban center. And the inhabitants of Sumatra traced their ancestry back to traditional highland territories in the west, and Sumatra itself, where the villagers were, had long been a place of interchange between Toba Batak, Simalayan Batak, and Malay speakers, right, who were anchored more so to the coastal trade. Now, Rama himself was only about 8 years old at this point, so he wasn't super active in the kinds of collecting that Bartlett was interested in. But there were others from the village and the surrounding area who also made Bartlett's acquaintance during this time. Now, Bartlett, for his part, arrived in the area as a horticultural consultant, working for U.S. Rubber, and U.S. Rubber had a plantation nearby where Bartlett's headquartered. Now, U.S. Rubber was particularly interested in Bartlett's work as a plant geneticist. This has been his area of specialization for a number of years. More specifically, his task was to advise on how to selectively breed and cultivate the most lucrative and pest-resistant varieties of rubber. But Bartlett's real passion in the years before he went to Sumatra was actually the evening primrose. This is a plant belonging to the species, the genus Henothera. And what fascinated Bartlett for Henothera is that it has a very unusual genetic structure and system of reproduction, which makes it exceptionally prone to genetic mutations. I just add, this is photo from my garden, where one of these cropped up my surprise. It's those mutations coming in handy, but I was delighted to notice this in the week before I came to Halifax. Now, Lewis Campos, who's here, has looked at this relationship between Bartlett and Henothera, and Campos intriguingly points to the fact that, as much as Henothera was kind of this plant that did not adhere to reproductive expectations, while Henothera specialists like Bartlett also didn't look to establish gender norms for reproductive norms. In particular, Bartlett seemed to prefer the company of men, including the phylogeneticist, mutationist, and evening primrose enthusiast he would agrees, and Bartlett also remained unmarried his entire life. So Campbell's quite fascinating and deploys this gender nonconformity to understand how what he calls Bartlett's mutant gaze may have helped to make visible forms of reproduction that did not adhere to established norms. And such a gaze may also have factored into how Bartlett was viewed by others, including, as Campbell points out, the numerous correspondents who saw fit to comment on his unmarried status. There are lots of letters to this effect, and there's not very many answers to this question. Now, one of these questions that I came across actually came from a Baltic observer named Mara Tibor Nangola. In 1920, Tibor wrote Bartlett, quote, "Did you marry, sir?" He asked, so adding that to the bottom of his letter. Tibor was working at a Goodyear plantation at the time. Bartlett, true to form, refused to answer that question. So Tibor didn't give up. He asked again the following year. But clearly, Bartlett was there. And this difference shaped his scientific insights, as Campos suggests. I also wonder if this difference caused him to be viewed differently. Right? And in particular, maybe this difference, the fact that he wasn't quite like other folks, maybe this made him seen as someone who could be a potential ally and accessory. Someone who could be strategically mobilized from other things, represent Bottic understandings of nature and interactions with nature in ways that refuse conformity with binary expectations. Right, that's my working hypothesis. Anyways, so what were those binary perspectives? What were those binary expectations? So the term ethnobotany had been coined relatively recently in 1895 by University of Pennsylvania botanist named John William Harshberger. And in Harshberger's formulation, ethnobotany described a field of inquiry that was all about exploiting indigenous plant knowledge in different ways, right? Exploiting it for commerce, right? For understanding historical plant geography, and also for measuring what Harshberger called the cultural position of beings. Right? This is kind of a pre-Boasian evolutionary framework here. So there's nothing here about attempting to understand indigenous interactions with nature on their own terms. Yeah, this is not coincidental. I mean, Harshberger was speaking nearly 2 years after Frederick Jackson Turner had declared America's western frontier closed. Turner hypothesized that America would soon need to spread that culture elsewhere. And this is also 1895, this is also 3 years after the Spanish-American War, which paved the way for further imperial explorations and activities in the Caribbean, Central and South America, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. So ethnocide is part and parcel of these endeavors. and decidedly so, right? Yeah. As Hirschberger saw it, right, wherever the American Empire went, the ethnoscience, the botany should go there as well. And in fact, commentators frequently used what they knew about indigenous and vernacular knowledges of nature to justify conversation. So the environmental worldviews of Southeast Asian Highlanders in particular were among many that were considered to be wasteful or primitive, awaiting the so-called improving hand of colonizers. So such perspectives have been, among other things, heavily gendered, tying into the long-standing Eurocentric association of nature with femininity and thereby subject to domination and exploitation, particularly with the advent of the mechanistic worldview in early modernity. Jungles have carried an especially potent gendered significance, right, as symbols of unruly feminine proliferation, hostile to masculine or phallocentric understanding or control. Alternatively, jungles are often represented as virgin landscapes, awaiting some form of intervention. Neither the season nor the flight of time leaves a mark on the forest for George Maxwell, a colonial administrator in British Malaya. Virgin in the days of which we cannot guess the morn, virgin in our days, virgin it will remain in the days of generations yet before. In either case, the binary gendering of jungle landscapes has served as a kind of prelude to and pretext for colonization. Rubber enterprises also got involved in this. Immense trees and thick bushes, rank straggling weeds and vines form an almost impenetrable jungle, described one account for children, published by the United States Rubber Company. To turn such a place into a garden spot means a genuine battle against jungle conditions. A picture scrapbook that's put together by Goodyear officials, chronicling the growth of a Goodyear rubber plantation just to the northwest of Sumatra in the 1920s and 1930s, devotes considerable space to describing this process as well, right? Describing the clearing of forests to set up plantations. So the caption, the one photo on the left there, reads, displaying a wall of trees and vegetation. The caption there reads, the impenetrable jungle, frontiers of Wingfoot concession. And this is followed on the right by a photo displaying a straight thoroughfare with trees encroaching on either side. The jungle is penetrated, the caption assumes. As Banu Subramanian and others remind us, gender constructs blur easily into other kinds of binary hierarchies, the masculine, feminine, the culture, nature, modern, primitive, civilized, savage, and others. The pervasiveness of this way of thinking amongst Dutch and American interests and the sultanates who were friendly to them, whereby anything that didn't resemble a permanent monoculture could be considered wasteland and consequently therefore taken, and if the price was right. This way of thinking enabled rubber enterprises to expand vigorously into the region with the spike in rubber prices that accompanied the First World War. It was this spike in rubber prices that actually brought Barnett to the plantations surrounding Sumatra. Now, although he was only there for a few months, this interval was sufficient for him to develop a thoroughgoing interest in lots of vernacular names. He wrote as much to Elmer Drumeri, who was then director of the New York Botanical Garden. So in the course of his plant collecting work in Sumatra, Bartlett wrote that he found columnar species preferable to more exotic, taxonomically significant ones, because these were the names that frequently were common names in the local dialect. He went so far, in fact, to request only specimens for which the botany expert with whom he worked knew the names. So this is, as many of us are probably familiar, this sentiment differed from how many botanists had felt up to this time about vernacular, local, and indigenous plant classifications, which has a host of scholarship has demonstrated, including mine, were frequently denigrated in favor by no means. But Bartlett was one of a growing number of ethnoscientists and bioprospectors who sort of followed in Harshberg's lead and who came to see these ways of naming and classifying plants as valuable for a host of botanical, anthropological, and commercial reasons. But Bartlett's evolved perspective, I would suggest, was not a function of some colonial scientific whim on his part. He didn't wake up one day and decide to do this. His experience, I would suggest, accords with that of many other case studies in the recent history of anthropology, which point to the ways in which colonized peoples have worked to shape anthropology to their own ends, right? Either through selectively revealing information, right, or selectively refusing to reveal certain kinds of information. And Bartlett's views, similarly to me, appear to have taken shape in conjunction with the botanical and environmental knowledge that Sumatra villagers and others were very eager to share with him, despite the abbreviated time of his visit. So in addition to making the acquaintance of Ramat, whom Bartlett would later train to collect plants and preserve herbarium specimens, Bartlett also met a young man named Vitus who was then around 17 or 18 years old, and he was actually in the course of training to succeed his father in the position of Datu. Datu is a Batak word referring to a priest or healer. And Bartlett would later recollect that during this time in 1918, Vitus was probably one of his best Batak assistants. Vitus sketched Anja, that's what this is here. This is a name for a Batak altar in 1918, and he labeled it Batak, and other village authorities suggested in this endeavor. That wasn't a matter of Bartlett swooping in and taking advantage of a young Datu. He chronicles and gives the names of other Datus who assisted in other Datus in training, who were also involved in these discussions, leading to this kind of work. It wasn't all smooth sailing. Some elements of traditional Batak society turned out to be harder to incorporate in the ways that Bartlett wanted than others. So on one occasion, in November 1918, Bartlett left on an automobile journey. He was accompanied by a Swiss doctor, by Tigor, who I mentioned a couple minutes ago, who went along and served as interpreter, and several other Batak men. And the mission they had in mind was to scout and locate an ancestral Batak grave site at a place called Bantal Lama. This is about 50 miles south of Sumatra, so quite a considerable distance. Now, the objects of Bartlett's visit were a pair of gravestones that depicted a Batak Raja, or the leader, and his wife. And Bartlett's aim was he wanted to photograph these images. The doctor, however, who accompanied them, wanted to go a step further, unbeknownst to the Batak men. The doctor wanted to come back later and steal the gravestones and display them as ornaments in his front yard. So Bartlett began this process once they located the gravestones by asking Tigor and several others to clear the lalong grass that grew around them. And several Batak men responded to this by warning that bad luck was sure to come of it. For the ghosts of the departed were very powerful and resent anyone coming to the graves, to say nothing of pulling grass and taking pictures. They were very nervous about the whole business and hoped that no harm would come of it. Now, on the return journey from this excursion, the party stopped for dinner at the Swiss Gander plantation, where I assume lots of drinking and revelry and so on was held, and they continued en route to where they were going at 8 p.m. Now, in the course of the drive, it just so happened they encountered a severe rainstorm, and this was made that much worse when the headlamps in the car began to run out of oil, and the car ultimately hit a ditch. Now, everyone escaped without serious injuries, except for Tigor, who flew through the windshield and sustained deep, serious cuts to his abdomen, to his face, and elsewhere. So poor Tigor was left vomiting from shock. intermittently drifting in and out of consciousness. And the rest of the party was stuck in the rain, in the dark, far from any large settlement. So through a chaotic series of events, the group is finally able to borrow a working car, not a very good one. And somehow they were able to make their way back to where they had originally stopped for dinner, and they were able to treat Tibor's wounds. It turned out they looked a lot scarier than they actually were. So as Bartlett reported, quote, "We will never be able to convince Tibor that the ghosts of Ban Orlando has something to do with it. And the doctor himself says that he hasn't sufficient conviction to argue with that. One thing he's sure, he isn't going to have those images in his front yard, even as a free gift for nothing." So following Bartlett's return to the United States, Ronald and the other villagers did not see him again until 1927. The interim years, Bartlett was very busy being chair of the botany department and getting taught all kinds of things at the University of Michigan. But in 1927, he was able to return to Sumatra for a year-long stint, not as a plantation consultant, but as a dedicated plant collector. He also spent a considerable amount of time staying in Sumatra itself. In fact, with none other than Ronald himself, in a house that Ronald had built for his mother. Other villagers likewise took advantage of Bartlett's increasing linguistic abilities in Malay and Batak to make his acquaintance, including a man named Ria Maraja, who served as village Raja. Too. So it was in this capacity, as leader and as Datu, that Ria Maraja elected to adopt Bartlett as a younger brother and a fellow Datu to assist him in several ceremonies. Here is from one of those occasions. And these ceremonies frequently involved plants as well. Now, by enrolling Bartlett as an affiliate or as an ally in this way, the people of Sumatra also shared the botanical and environmental knowledge. And this impressed Bartlett considerably with what he considered to be the villagers' extensive and scientifically verifiable grasp of species, of varieties, of interspecies relationships, and habitat information. Their knowledge, he wrote, is often found to be surprisingly effective when scientifically checked. The botanist will find that his difficulties vanish as if by magic if he undertakes to learn the flora as the natives know it using their plant names, their criteria for identification, which frequently neglect the fruiting parts entirely, and their turn for habitats and types of plant. It's intriguing for me to note Bartlett's attention to the fact that botanic classifications were not nearly as reliant on reproductive characteristics as their Euro-American counterparts. And I do wonder if it wasn't this characteristic of botanic plant taxonomy that underlay Bartlett's almost immediate enthusiasm for learning botanic plant in 1918. Fresh as he was from his research into the mutant reproductive significance of the author. Now, botanic plant names and classification were not the only topics of interest for Bartlett that did not synchronize with an imperial binary imagination. Another issue that the people of Sumatra were particularly keen on communicating to Bartlett, and which he in turn communicated in his published writing, was that a lot of what colonizers called wilderness or wasteland were actually cultivated or semi-cultivated forests. One of the frequent complaints of the natives when they are moved out of lands granted to foreigners as plantation concessions, Bartlett reported, is that their claims to private ownership of apparently wild plants is made light of. On the contrary, he argued, Batak villagers improved the lands surrounding their village by seeding useful plants, such that many rural areas with apparently lowlands, for instance in Sumatra, resemble at a distance a sea of rice fields with numerous wooded islands in which the villages are concealed. Right? So all of this was by design. Now, although these are Bartlett's words, they are also highly hypothesized claims to Batak territorial proprietorship and sovereignty. Whereas the people of Sumatra carefully pointed out to Bartlett, there is nothing wasteful or wild whatsoever about the forests surrounding their villages, despite imperial claims to the contrary. So Goodyear, US Rubber, and no doubt other large plantation interests might view as jungles, awaiting concentration or civilization, or however they want to describe the intervention they want to make. But the people, and by extension Bartlett, knew that many of these territories were gardens of sword, albeit not a sword that colonizers were inclined to recognize. So Bartlett was thus dismayed at the cultural and ecological devastation that he witnessed through the process of draining wetlands and clearing and burning native forests to make way for these floating plantations. In 1927, this is an incident that really resonated with him when he witnessed a cut clearing for the US government, particularly, right, his former employer. So as he described in a 1928 publication, one of these concessions, quote, left a vivid memory of crashing jungle, the howling of disconsolate monkeys, surrounded by smoke and crackling fires that followed the first felling, the grotesque skeletons of charred trees that remained after the first burning, the little infernos watched over by satanic celestials during the second burning, when 100 fires kept the sky aglow all night. The burning was followed by a turning of the soil and drainage of the swamps, not plant or animal remained. It was sad to see things dying that can never be replaced. This scenario would have been an especially pressing concern for the people of Sumatra, who resided a mere 20 minutes walk from a US government plantation. And I would hypothesize that it was this apprehension regarding further plantation encroachments that served as motivation, right, to solicit the help of an outsider like Bartlett in translating botanical and environmental knowledge into terms that prospective colonizers might more readily sympathize with. Now, the difference in these worldviews were and are significant. Potawatomi ecologists, Robert Wall Kimmerer, described just how profoundly settler perspectives on land differed from American indigenous, to take a very different context. In the settler mind, she writes, land is property, real estate, capital, or natural resources, but to our people it was everything. Identity, the connection to our ancestors, the home of our non-human kindred, our pharmacy, our library, the source of all that sustains us. Our land for where our responsibility to the world was enacted, sacred ground. It belonged to itself. It was a gift, not a commodity, so it could never be bought or sold. So to judge from the readiness with which Bartlett's interlocutors shared their knowledge with him, Baltic botanical and ecological vocabulary, even in the lowlands, appears to have functioned similarly, not only as a storehouse of useful knowledge for day-to-day life, but also as an archive of identity, ownership, custodianship, and resistance to extractive colonizing interests. These circumstances shape Bartlett's individual relationship with plant experts as well. One doctor, whose name was Birdsall, chose to accompany Bartlett on much of his botanical work in 1927. He was very generous in sharing Baltic plant knowledge uses with him. But the one who really stood out was Rama. Rama was especially dedicated in his development. Bartlett described Rama, who was then around 16 years old. I think that's on this picture. Let's take a look. Rama sitting with a bundle of plants under his arm there. Bartlett described him as, quote, a cheerful boy of inexhaustible energy, who on one occasion felt so humiliated by his failure to climb a tree that he invented an excuse to leave his work the next day, returning triumphant with the flowers that he had coveted. Now, Rama and Bartlett undertook numerous excursions in lowland areas and traditional Western Highland territories alike. And there's lots of successes that they had. But amidst these successes, they also encountered frequent difficulties. So in their search for lots of traditional ceremonial buildings, known as Parceloa, Bartlett noted that although he was able to photograph several of these in 1918, only one of these Parceloa was still standing in 1927. And locating the structure required no small amount of ingenuity and chicanery. Right? Even with Ramat with him, this was still very difficult work. The natives refused to tell where it was. He wrote into the highland he was working in. But by hunting diligently, fording a deep river, and finally subsidizing a small boy, the writer found him. Now, one marker of whether a Parsimon was still in operation, Bartlett noted, was the presence or absence of sacred plant species within them. So these included many plants that the people of Sumatra shared with him, which were notable for their fragrance, right, for their color, or even for their psychoactive properties. One notable plant was the beetle nut palm. And some food plants were also in these enclosures as well, and could be made sacred by their presence there, including coconut palms. On the other hand, if a community had converted to Islam, these plants would no longer be in use, and they would be destroyed by animals. Now, elsewhere, Bartlett noted the conferral of offerings of betel or cedar leaves that were, quote, set up by the writer's native companions to propitiate mountain spirits who might have been annoyed by the disturbance caused by botanists. Kind of an echo of what happened on that carbide cedar gravestones so many years earlier. At any rate, the trust that Bartlett was able to garner in Sumatra did not easily transfer to the context. Now, Bartlett's collecting efforts did not end with the end of his sojourn in Sumatra in 1927. Over the next decade or so, long after he returned to the University of Michigan, Bartlett paid Ramat to collect and try and press scores of herbarium specimens for him and provided unparalleled into Batak ethnobotany along the way. Ramat's collections can in fact be found throughout major herbaria in the United States and elsewhere. The specimen collection often numbering in the thousands. Not surprisingly, the University of Michigan Herbarium has the largest collection of them. But Bartlett had a very specific role in ensuring that Ramat's name circulated so widely. It is not frequently advised, he wrote, that herbarium labels in botanical literature be left uncomplicated with the names of native collectors. And one well-known botanist has protested mildly with me for not issuing Ramat's collections as Bartlett's collector. Ramat, however, is a worker of unusual skill and discrimination, whose intelligence and zeal, even though he has had no formal schooling, entitle him to an honorable place among tropical collectors of any race or nation. I feel strongly that the individuality of his contribution should not be submerged. Ramat, however, spoke only Batak in Malay. He did not speak English. Where he did not speak Dutch either. So he relied largely on Bartlett's intercession to make a botanical living. And when Bartlett wasn't around, Ramat communicated and sent specimens to Bartlett via American Methodist missionaries. Despite working closely with the missionaries, though, Bartlett did not collect plants as a Christian, but rather as a Muslim. Now, the compromise he struck as a Muslim who worked so closely with Bartlett and with the missionaries was that he would remain a Muslim, but adhere to what Bartlett, paraphrasing his missionary correspondent, called Ramat's Christian virtues, including his fine character and sustained eloquence. Sure, what is particularly Christian about that? That was what the missionaries of Bartlett thought. By 1935, however, rumor had that a change was afoot, and that Ramat was in fact contemplating marriage to a Christian woman, which Bartlett feared would lead to resentment in his home village, which would obligate Ramat to thus give up his share in collective ownership of the territory. Although Bartlett suggested when the place is ultimately taken for a concession, the officials and manager would probably join forces to ensure that the natives get little or nothing for their land and property. The natives are, as a rule, very unfairly treated in the matter of property rights. So Ramat's collecting and translating efforts are in all likelihood inseparable from these wider circumstances, which discouraged the future on his family's land, but which also at the same time opened up alternate possibilities for him as a paid emissary of American scientific interests. Now, although Ramat's partnership with Bartlett had its advantages for him, clearly, it did come potentially at a cost. Although Bartlett saw Batak cultures, knowledges, and territories very differently from most colonial figures, in many ways, not surprisingly, his work is also inextricable from its colonial context. So although Bartlett criticized the process of clearing lands for plantations, as we saw, he also used these clearances as an opportunity to collect taxonomically significant but difficult to reach parts of plants from the treetops after they were felled, right? Rather than pay for someone to go up and get those things for him, or have the ability to tries to climb the tree himself and get those things. Bartlett even apologized for his lament regarding the forest clearances in a letter that he wrote to the vice president of Stuart Hotchkiss. I hope you won't think my little wail about the destruction of the jungle isn't too horribly sentimental, he wrote. But you know I am sort of a sentimentalist anyways. So you can see that his work is pulling him in one direction, and his affiliations are pulling him in another direction. Right? This is the translation makes these things very complicated. And as concerned as art was to do justice to the individuality of Ramat, who was to recall a Batak lowlander descended from a Highland people, the same concern did not quite extend to the same extent to Batak people who remained in the Highlands. In a 1928 publication, Bartlett included pictures of two Highland Batak men. He did include their names, but at the same time, the photo captions also used the de-individualized natural history language of racial type. Thus, whereas Bartlett viewed Ramat as a botanical collector more or less on par with his own abilities, he tended to view Batak Highlanders more so as ethnological materials to be collected. So whatever incentives Batak individuals and communities may have had for working outside of Bartlett, Bartlett's own priorities were more closely aligned, it seems, with the metropolitan institutions he represented. At the University of Michigan, American Philosophical Society, Smithsonian Institution, and numerous herbarium and other scientific bodies with which he corresponded. One major point of emphasis, in fact, in Bartlett's botanical and scientific work was on the instrumental value of plant knowledge for imperial and colonial concerns. Quote, the local classification of vegetational types is so serviceable and natural that it only needs to be taken over and scientifically formulated to make available to science information that's already local knowledge. And so this taking over by translation aligns with what the Mohawk anthropologist Audrey Simpson has written regarding high costs involved when colonized peoples make themselves legible, thereby translatable and thereby governable to colonizers. Bartlett's Batak friendships thus do not appear to have outweighed other more conventionally imperial motivations. Despite Bartlett's humanization of lowland Batak peoples who did not accord with imperial binary expectations then, binaries such as modern and primitive science and superstition, civilized and savage, perhaps drawn from his own heterodox frame of reference, and despite his close involvement with the people of Ceylon Raja, culminating in his own translation, too. Bartlett was nonetheless a knowing, yet ambivalent contributor to the colonizing processes he observed. Now, Ramat's own sentiments about pursuing botanical research in and around the Highland territories of his ancestors, this, on the other hand, remains an open question. Had Ramat come to view himself as a colonial outsider, or was his subject position, like Bartlett's, more complicated? Right? To what extent had this translating work transformed him in the process? don't quite have an answer to this question. Although certainly if he's contemplating switching to Christianity, he was certainly considering some kind of change. At any rate, after 1936, Rama and Bartlett ceased to have contact with each other. Actually, this is the last photo of that's Rama on the right there. This is the last photo of Rama that Bartlett has from 1935. Now, Bartlett was in fact keen to continue employing Rama permanently as a collector, tried to convince him to take up work outside Sumatra, in New Guinea and elsewhere. Rama wasn't interested, and he preferred instead to remain closer to home and establish himself in a shop in Quesada. So this was likely a key turning point for him, how he had come to see himself as a Batak and a Muslim who would do far better to remain as such, rather than fundamentally transformed, taken in another direction entirely. Rama thus lost his contact with Bartlett through the American Methodist Mission, and when Bartlett found himself unable to establish contact with Rama years later, he suspected that Rama would likely not even answer to his Batak name. He also wondered whether many of the inhabitants of Sumatra and surrounding areas had perhaps not perished during World War II. I haven't been able to ascertain one way or another what happened to Rama or any of these other individuals. Now, Anna Singh has described how scientific networks abound in what she calls messy uncertainties and relational entanglements that simultaneously enable and undermine the hegemony. Such a formulation surely describes the relationship between Rama and the people of Sumatra on the one hand and Bartlett on the other. Indeed, for peoples on the receiving end of colonial and imperial inequities, whether or not to cooperate in ethnoscientific projects like Bartlett's is hardly a straightforward decision, right? Misuse is rife, as knowledge is taken out of context, as circulated and translated far from the context of origin in imperial museums, in ethnographic and botanical publications, in pharmaceutical laboratories and elsewhere. These very same circumstances can also, however, spur the search for allies, even very imperfect ones, Bartlett, who can themselves perhaps be translated, who could be made to see and represent the situation of marginalized peoples in a less binary fashion. Now, the knowledge-making relationship between Rama and Bartlett, thus for me, provides an intriguing case study, not only in the means by which ethnoscientists have translated vernacular and imperial knowledge systems, but also in how colonized peoples themselves have strategically mobilized intermediaries like Bartlett, as fraught and problematic as they obviously were, in the service of making their knowledge, their expertise, and their territorialities measured on their own terms. So I hope that gives us some food for thought with respect to how complex and hopefully interesting the metaphoric translation can be for us in explaining not only how knowledge moves, but also what other kinds of transformations are part of that process. And I also hope this presentation has given us maybe some different ways of thinking outside those binaries that Monty was talking about last night as well. So with that, I will leave it there.
Well, because like Fatih, your class, we have a couple of minutes that we can have some questions just before 12:50 or yeah. Yep. 12:15 when we're finished. So any questions or? Right, Edwin.
Yeah, thanks for that. Really interesting paper. I was just wondering, just a quick question. You described how the Batak withheld information on where their ceremonial sites are. I wondered if you could maybe fill us a bit on the reasons for why they did that. I mean, it's really interesting because I've looked at some of the first European contacts with these communities, and that the Europeans also complain that they are withholding certain economic pieces of information on botany, etc., and the natural world. So it seems like there's a correlation going through for 300 years.
Yeah, I can't speak as effectively as probably you can to stuff going back 300 years, but more approximately to the 20th century, there were a series of wars and other things fought between Baltic Highlanders and the Dutch. There was quite a violent and effective resistance movement that I believe was only defeated in 1907 or something like that. And so my suspicion is that with Bartlett traveling to these places, that he would have been seen as an emissary of European interests, which in some ways, of course, he was. So that's my suspicion for why it was so difficult for him to do this kind of work in the highland territories to the west. In the lowland territories to the east, it was a little bit different. It was not the same kind of fractious relationship, as I understand it, between Dutch and Baltic people, partly because the Dutch were able to work more indirectly through Malay Sultanate intermediaries who did, in some ways, some of the dirty work for them. Thank you for that question. That's Leah.
So you also talked about the fact that Bartlett himself becomes more sympathetic to the Dutch cause in a sense. And it would be interesting to know how well that goes down in the US. Is he a voice of the wilderness, or is that well received?
That's interesting. I don't know about the specific conflicts with respect to Baltic or Sumatra ethnoscience after Bartlett, partly because that's right before the Second World War, right before Indonesian independence. But he was somebody who was very influential in training another ethnoscientist named Harold Connell, who he met later on towards the end of his life, circa 1948 in the Philippines. So some of what Bartlett is saying, in some ways find an echo in what Connell was doing, also behind Philippines, and also working very closely with Ethnoscientific people in particular. Right, so this is Bartlett is one of the figures that kind of starts doing ethnocide a little bit differently. And my hypothesis is that the people of Sumatra had a lot to do with that kind of thing himself.
We're going to stop now so we can have a announcement from one of the brains behind this.
I'm gonna do it.